Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Elizabeth Armour. We're here at Vancouver's Hungarian Cultural Society at 728 Kingsway, where people are beginning to arrive to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution and freedom fight. You may have noticed the Hungarian and Canadian flags flying above the entrance. At present, Mr. Csaba and Mr. Elemir Lazar of the RCMP are greeting the Honourable Wally Opal, Attorney General of BC. Behind him is Mr. Laszlo, President of the Cultural Society. Here we see Mr. Edward Fast, Conservative Member of Parliament for Abbotsford, BC. The Honourable Ujjal Desange is greeted by Mr. Lazar, Mr. Tushko, and members of the RCMP.
Looking good?
The arriving guests are signing the guest book. Mr. Andrei Molnar, Honorary Consul General of the Republic of Hungary, and Mrs. Molnar are chatting with Mr. Lazar. There is a reception underway with delicious sandwiches and white and red wine. Mrs. Eva Kossuth, producer of today's event, is greeting the keynote speaker, Dr. Greg Donaghy from Foreign Affairs Canada. Here is Ms. Georgina Hegedűs, producer of tomorrow's Hungarian event. Mr. Leslie Csordas, President of the National Council of Greater Vancouver, and Mr. John Boroksho, one-time President of the Cultural Society. Hello everyone. May I please present to you Mr. Laszlo, President of the Hungarian Cultural Society of Greater Vancouver.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a good afternoon. I would like to welcome all of you and thank you very much for coming to this solemn event of commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. I also want to extend my thanks and appreciation to the organizing committee and their associates for their hard work in organizing this commemoration. The event we remember today was one of the most significant, memorable, albeit tragic, in a Hungarian history. In the autumn of 1956, the nation of 10 million souls rose up against the Soviet domination and the communist rule. The Western powers were preoccupied with Suez crisis, and the Soviet leadership sensed that it had free hand to suppress the uprising, and the Red Army crushed the revolution by the end of 1956. Although the uprising failed in its immediate objective, it was not in vain. The revolution turned out to be an important, inspiring milestone on the road to the communism collapse. As a result of the Soviet intervention, some 200,000 Hungarians fled their homeland during the brief window of opportunity before the borders were slammed shut again. The luckiest expatriates have been those of us who ended up in this magnificent country and this beautiful province. We found here what we so reluctantly left behind in Hungary, a great land and great people. The blessings we also found included democracy, personal freedom, and free enterprise. While leaving the homeland was extremely traumatic at the time, living in Canada turned out like a happy second marriage after a nasty divorce forced upon us. We cannot thank the Almighty and the Canada enough for our good fortune. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for coming, and I sincerely hope that you will enjoy our program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simon. Our next speaker is Mr. Andrei Molnar, Honorary Consul General of the Republic of Hungary for British Columbia.
Ladies and gentlemen, and honored guests, members of parliament, members of the legislature, and all the Hungarian freedom fighters who sit between us. I know, and you know, that many of you have actually participated in the revolution in '56, and we are very proud to have those people among us over the last 50 years. I was just an 11-year-old young boy in '56, and my memories are very vivid, particularly after the revolution, once I could get out of the house and see what happened. I would like to thank, on behalf of the President of Hungary, Mr. Solyon, for this fantastic event that you have put on with the leadership of the Hungarian community and Mr. Sanyi and Mr. Csordas. I would like to congratulate all the people who worked for this successful two-day event to commemorate one of the most important historical events in freedom fighting, in fight for freedom, and also in Hungarian history. The results are speaking for themselves. Hungary is today a free democratic country, And though we enjoy our life in Canada and we're very thankful to live here, I think it's a nice feeling for all of us to know that Middle Europe has changed, and the 1956 revolution was a major catalyst to create and ignite and further that change what finally took place. On behalf of the consulate, which I represent, the consulate of the Republic of Hungary, and on behalf of my colleague Zoltán Vas, I would like to wish you a great celebration, and on behalf of the Hungarian government, I thank you very much for your excellent and dedicated work in our new country, remembering our old country. Have a great 2 days. Thank you.
And Mr. Leslie Csordas, President of the Hungarian National Council of Greater Vancouver, to come and introduce our distinguished guests. Mr. Csordas.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege today to read to you part of a proclamation of the province of British Columbia, and I quote, "Whereas the government of British Columbia recognizes the 1956 Hungarian Revolution as a heroic fight for freedom and democracy, and whereas Hungarian Freedom Day is a public acknowledgement of the 50th anniversary of the heroic struggle and fight for freedom of an entire nation, it invites the people of British Columbia and Canada to commemorate this historic event. And whereas our Lieutenant Governor, by and with the advice of and consent of the Executive Council, has been pleased to enact in Council 903 on October 11, 2002, now know ye that we do by these presents proclaim and declare that October 23rd, 2006 shall be known as Hungarian Freedom Day in British Columbia. It is my great pleasure to greet and introduce our distinguished guests who did us the honor of attending this very special event. Please hold your applause until I have come to the end. Thank you. Mr. Edward Fast, Conservative Member of Parliament for Abbotsford, British Columbia, representing the federal government. The Honorable Wally Opal, QC, Attorney General of British Columbia, Minister responsible for multiculturalism, representing the Government of British Columbia. The Honorable Ujjal Dosanjh, Member of Parliament for Vancouver South. He may have left to go to his own nomination meeting at 3 o'clock, but he was here before this afternoon. Mr. Zoltán Vas, Honorary Consul of the Republic of Hungary for British Columbia. Mr. Bradford Johnson, Chief of Consular Affairs, United States Consulate. Mr. Bill Siksai, NDP Member of Parliament for Burnaby Douglas. Mr. Douglas Duran, Cultural Planner, Office of Cultural Affairs, City of Vancouver. Mr. Andy Zlot, President of the Austria Vancouver Club, and his wife, Mrs. Helen Zlot. Also present from the Austria Vancouver Club are Mrs. Gisela Rabol, Sports Director, and her husband, Mr. Eric Rabol. I want to take this opportunity to express our heartfelt appreciation to the Austrian government and nation for their unprecedented compassion, generosity, and hospitality they extended to the Hungarian refugees in 1956-57. Mr. Zlot, please convey our thanks to your government. Thank you. Dr. Krzysztof Szopnicki, President of the Polish Veterans Association of Vancouver. And last but not least, I have the pleasure of presenting to you today keynote speaker, Dr. Greg Donaghy, Deputy Director, Historical Section, Foreign Affairs, Canada, who came all the way from Ottawa to be with us today. And now I would ask Mr. Edward Fast, representing the federal government, to read the letter of the Right Honorable Stephen Harper, Prime Minister of Canada.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, so much for inviting me to this event. And I bring you greetings on behalf of the Government of Canada. And I've been asked to read a letter of greeting from the Prime Minister. I am pleased to extend my warmest greetings to everyone attending the Hungarian National Council of Greater Vancouver's commemoration of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. In the months after the revolution was crushed, Canada welcomed almost 40,000 Hungarian refugees. These refugees fled alone or with their families, sometimes in much larger groups, and arrived in Canada carrying but very little. Canadians worked to welcome them, to help build them lives in a new land. Decades later, the spirit of revolution came again to Hungary, and many of these 56ers, some of whom had been chased away as children and were now grown to adulthood, returned to their homeland. They brought with them the skills and experience they had developed in Canada and carried back to Hungary their enthusiasm for the project of freedom and peace. Since 1956, and particularly since the New Start in 1989, Canada has been a friend to the Hungarian people. Hungarian Canadians have played important roles in the development of both countries and have occasionally helped bridge the wide Atlantic which would otherwise separate us. Today, Canada and Hungary are allies and partners in multilateral organizations such as NATO and the United Nations. We work together to promote freedom and democracy around the world, to defend the freedoms of the weak, to bring the prosperity we enjoy to people who have less. We will continue to strive to be better friends in the years to come. 50 years ago, Canada was shocked by the tragedy of the revolution in Hungary. Today, we remember those who died and suffered. We remember those who fled Hungary, including the many who came to Canada. And we do not forget the freedoms Hungarians fought for then, nor those who have fought for them since. Stephen Harper, Prime Minister of Canada, Ottawa, 2006. And I'd also like to pass on my own personal greetings on behalf of the people of Abbotsford. We do actually have a very small Hungarian community in Abbotsford. And today we honor not only your courage, we commend you for your perseverance over these many years, and we celebrate with you this defining moment in the history of Hungary. And it's not only a defining moment in Hungary's history, it's also a defining moment in Canada's history, because in 1956, some 40,000 Hungarians came to Canada. And even though many Hungarians believed that they were receiving the generosity of Canada at the time, in fact it was Canada who was the big beneficiary. And today, you as a community, you've contributed all these years in building a stronger, free Canada, and we commend you for that. And I wish you the very best as you continue to celebrate this occasion. Thank you.
Mr. President, and please convey our thanks to the Prime Minister for remembering our most important anniversary. Now we have the honour to have with us today the Honourable Wally Oho, Attorney General, British Columbia, Minister responsible for multiculturalism, representing British Columbia government. Mr. Oho will read a letter from the Premier of British Columbia, the Right Honourable Gordon Campbell, and thereafter will share a few thoughts of his own. Thank you so much for coming.
Honourable Consul General Molnar, Honourable Consul General Bosch, honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm most pleased to be here on behalf of the province of British Columbia. At the outset, I want to read a letter from Premier Gordon Campbell. It reads, "As Premier of the province of British Columbia, I am pleased to join with the Hungarian National Council of Greater Vancouver in welcoming everyone to the two-day commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. I would like to extend special greetings to the keynote speaker, Mr. Greg Donaghy, from Foreign Affairs Canada. One of the great things about living in Canada is our ability to respect other cultures and traditions and appreciate the histories of people from all over the world. Our diversity is a source of pride. It enriches our knowledge and understanding of other people and their roots, their differences and their similarities, and the experiences they and their ancestors have endured. I would like to recognize the work of the Hungarian National Council in sponsoring the celebration in remembrance of the past sacrifices, Hungarian national heroes, and cultural history. I am sure your efforts will be appreciated by everyone in attendance. On behalf of the people of British Columbia, please accept my best wishes for a meaningful and memorable anniversary commemoration. Sincerely, Gordon Campbell, Premier." As the Attorney General and Minister of Multiculturalism, I want to pass on a few remarks of my own. It was early this past spring that Andre Molnar and the Honourable Ambassador visited our office in Vancouver, and I expressed to Andre, who I've known for many years and who's been a leader in our community, that the province wanted to do something to commemorate the courage of the people who were involved in the Hungarian Revolution, and also the people who make up the Hungarian community here in this province. And it was with that in mind that we declared this, and they had a proclamation declaring this to be Hungarian National Freedom Day. I want to I spoke to Premier Campbell about that when Andre Molnar and the ambassador came to see me, and he was wholeheartedly in support of recognizing what had taken place at that time. Now, your president said at the outset that the events of October 23rd, 1956 were one of the most important in Hungarian history. In fact, they were one of the most important events of the 20th century. I was a young boy here growing up in British Columbia when the revolution took place. And I still remember watching the 6 o'clock news on black and white TV as the tanks were rolling into Budapest. And it was something that captured the world. And I remember as a young boy watching and the courage of the people who fought against those tanks, fought against that army, fought against totalitarianism. It's extremely gratifying to know that people fought for their freedoms spontaneously, and we in British Columbia were recipients of the people who fought for their freedoms. Some 40,000 people came to Canada. I remember, and still in this province, we were the beneficiaries of the Sopron Faculty of Forestry at the University of British Columbia. And I can tell you, the Sopron group of
foresters that came here distinguished themselves and did so much for the furtherance of this province. And I understand some of them are here today, and I want to acknowledge your presence. The Hungarian refugees overcame many hardships to become Canadians who have contributed to the cultural, economic, and social development of our province. The government of British Columbia recognizes the 1956 Hungarian Revolution as a heroic fight for freedom and democracy. Hungarian Freedom Day reminds us of the strength and the prosperity that are the heritage of all British Columbians, whom we share the wisdom, the tradition, culture, and arts of our many origins and perspectives. Our culturally diverse communities enrich the social fabric of our province. They bring economic advantages, generate innovation, and attract industries and people that benefit the province as a whole. They reflect the diversity, the culture, one more reason why British Columbia is the best place in the world to live. We in British Columbia live in a free society, a democratic society. We cherish diversity. We celebrate our differences. But it's important to remember, we are Canadians and we live in the best country in the world. I want to thank you, the organizers of this event, for inviting me here today. I want to tell you that it's a privilege for me to attend here, acknowledging the heroic deeds, the heroism of the people who fought at that time in 1956. Thank you for honoring the 50th anniversary of the heroic struggle and the fight for freedom that was the Hungarian Revolution. Thank you for inviting the people of British Columbia to commemorate this very historic event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Opel. Please convey our thanks to Mr. Campbell on our behalf. Our next speaker is Dr. Chris Szafnicki, President of the Polish Veterans Association of Vancouver. Polish-Hungarian friendship is legendary and it reaches back centuries. We always supported each other in good times and in bad. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Dr. Szafnicki.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm deeply moved. Hard not to be. Hard not to be. I'm here for the, well, was it 100 times we've met before we organized that Together in Freedom? Around that, 100 meetings before we could launch a joint commemorations in 1999 of the day, of the moment when Hungary and Poland and other countries became members of NATO. That was a very important moment in my life, our life, and I think the life of Europe and the world. And that brings me right to the heart of this event, of this day. As many speakers have already mentioned, in 1956, the fall of 1956, October 1956, was a turning point in European history, and specifically in the history of two small European, not so big European countries, so Poland and Hungary. We will never forget, ladies and gentlemen, we Poles will never forget that the rally organized in Budapest by students was a rally in support of Polish workers and Polish people who at the same time tried to do what the Hungarians always dreamed about, to get rid of communism. And on that day, 23rd, happened something that nobody could foresee. And as some of the speakers before me brought memories of that day, I would like to add mine. I was in Poland. I was 12 years old. And on summer morning of that week of 23rd of October, I went to a cinema and I saw a Polish newsreel. And it was a short piece. And I remember it after 50 years, moment by moment. Because the newsreel showed us the inhabitants of Warsaw queuing for hours. And guess why they were queuing for hours? What they wanted to do. They wanted to give blood. And they gave blood because there wasn't enough blood in all Hungary to treat the wounded. When I watched it as a 12-year-old boy, I couldn't understand it even. Now I understand it better. Why Poles immediately reacted and why the reaction was really such a deep and such genuine. Because we owed so much to our Hungarian friends on that day. Because Hungary took the main blow of the Soviet fury, and we were saved. We Poles were saved, but you Hungarians were not. We will always eternally be grateful to you. Thank you. God bless you and your country.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shevnitsky. That was a fabulous recollection. What a friendship we have between two countries. Next, we will hear the moving poem, Gloria Victis, written in honor of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution by Canadian poet and writer Watson Kirkconnell. It'll be recited by the lovely and talented Livia Polyak.
Gloria Victis by Watson Kirkconnell. How shall we thank the men and maids heroic, who faced with valiant hearts and empty hands, a saurian monster from the Mesozoic, an armored dragon from the darkened lands? Out of the schoolroom and the busy smithy, out of the kitchen and the draper's shop, they swarmed exultant into Vulcan stithy. In freedom's name, they bade the horror stop. Then, for a moment, from the beast malignant, there came no rip of claw, no gnash of tooth. Attentive lest awakened world indignant should rouse from sloth and strike a blow for truth. The West was silent, and the Brontosaurus, bellowing down the streets of those dark days, trampled to blood and death the youthful chorus that sang but now in liberty's high praise. Yet who can log to love the grave's black portal? Deep in the anguish of the poet's mind, the Magyar spirit shall abide immortal and rise triumphant to redeem mankind.
Thank you so much, Livia, for this moving rendition. That was very moving. And now, ladies and gentlemen, our distinguished keynote speaker, Dr. Greg Donaghy, will deliver his address. Dr. Donaghy is head of the historical section of the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade in Ottawa. He came to Vancouver specifically for this occasion. He's the editor of the publication Canadian Diplomacy in the Hungarian Revolution, 1956 to 57, a documentary perspective. So please extend a hearty welcome to Dr. Donaghy.
Absolutely delighted I am to be here, and to thank Eva Kossuth and the organizing committee for making it, extending the invitation. It strikes me that there are two important fundamental differences between me and the other speakers this afternoon. First, they are truly all distinguished, whereas I am not. The second important difference is they were all brief, and I will not be. Let me begin. I titled my talk as a look at kind of Canadian diplomacy and the reaction to the Hungarian Revolution. As he left his office in the Woods building on a gray November afternoon, soon after Soviet troops had re-entered the Hungarian capital Budapest, Earl McCarthy, the young, keen, newly promoted Chief of Movement and Control for Canada's Immigration Department, was hailed by his Deputy Minister, the distinguished and stately Colonel Laval Fauché. How, the Colonel demanded, can we get these poor Hungarians to Canada as quickly as possible? Shaken by this sudden encounter with bureaucratic greatness, McCarthy hesitated and then burst out, "Gosh, fly them over." 3 words that amply illustrate the main motifs of the celebrated national myth that has grown up around Canada's response to the Hungarian crisis. That Canada was swift, unorthodox, and generous. There are grounds for a strong sense of national self-satisfaction in the Canadian reaction to the crisis. Of the 200,000 or so refugees that spilled out of Hungary in the wake of Moscow's decision to brutally crush the revolt, Canada welcomed almost 40,000, the largest contingent of any country, and a number disproportionate to Canada's small size. The arrival of these migrants, as well as their lasting significance for Canada's immigration and refugee policy, have dominated the discussion of the Canadian role. The inaccessibility of government records until recently, and the overriding importance to Canada of the Suez crisis, which happened at the same time, have reinforced this tendency to focus the discussion on Canada as a haven for refugees. But Canada's response to the Hungarian crisis was more complex, and its implications further reaching than this narrow perspective suggests. Though the refugees remain central in any retelling of the story, and I'll talk about that today, the documentary record suggests a less triumphant view of Ottawa's handling of the Hungarian exodus, with policy in the hands of an uncertain and hesitant government. Moreover, and this is my second theme this afternoon, the Hungarian Revolution had important and often overlooked implications to Canada's relations with Hungary and Canadian foreign policy for much of the balance of the Cold War. The prospects for peace and security in Europe appeared better in January 1956 than they had since the end of the Second World War. For almost a decade, relations between the totalitarian Soviet Union and the American-led Western democracies, including Canada, had been gripped in a rigid and dangerous Cold War. Bilateral contacts had virtually ceased by 1947, while multilateral exchanges at the new United Nations were largely reduced to bitter volleys of ill-tempered recriminations. It was worse in Asia. There, the two sides and their proxies traded bombs with bullets in a series of vicious post-colonial struggles that often flirted with atomic annihilation. Stalin's death in 1953, the Geneva Conference on the Korean War in 1954, and the July 1955 summit in Geneva seemed at last to herald a period of reduced global tensions. In Ottawa, diplomat Robert Ford, a reserved intellectual with a burgeoning national reputation as a poet, was responsible for making sense of these developments. During the summer of 1954, in a widely circulated memorandum, Ford set out to define a new approach to the Soviet Union. Like most of his colleagues, he was a consummate realist whose understanding of Soviet diplomacy was rooted in his reading of Russian history. Warning against dramatic change, Ford argued that Soviet policies of outward pressure on its western borders and large, standing aggressive military forces reflected traditional Russian preoccupations and enjoyed widespread support among Stalin's successors. What Moscow wanted, Ford suggested, was, quote, a workable division of the world more or less along the present lines. It was a wrenching departure for Canadian policy to accept the status quo in Central Europe as permanent. But this policy promised important dividends to the government in the mid-1950s. Canada might reduce its heavy defense burdens while still deterring a more complacent Soviet Union from expanding. Meanwhile, Ford proposed that Canada increase its trade, scientific, cultural, artistic links with the Soviet Union, insisting that even such small steps may in time have some mellowing effect on the Soviet concept of living with their neighbors. Consequently, in late 1955, Ottawa proceeded with plans for a stepped-up program of official exchanges and agreed to start talks with Moscow on a bilateral trade agreement. Ottawa's confidence in Moscow's intentions was reinforced when Khrushchev denounced Stalin during the 20th Communist Party Congress in February 1956. There can be little doubt that the myth of Stalin is now being completely demolished, exalted Lester B. Pearson, Canada's foreign policy. Now the body of Stalin, he said, like that of Oliver Cromwell, is post-mortem, likely to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Improved relations with Moscow brought a quickening in Canada's contacts with the satellite states, including Hungary. Ottawa's links with the government in Budapest, which had deeply angered Canadian Catholics by imprisoning Cardinal Joseph Mindszenty in 1948, had been especially distant. Despite repeated pleas from Budapest, Canada had refused consistently in the 1940s and 1950s to establish diplomatic relations with Hungary. This detached view began to change in the spring of 1956. Ford insisted that Khrushchev's rapprochement with Tito, the denigration of Stalin, and the rehabilitation of national leaders in Eastern Europe offered at last some hope of independence, however limited. To exploit these developments, Ford urged the West to abandon its rhetorical commitment to the liberation of the satellites, which only alarmed Moscow and raised impossible expectations. Instead, Canada and its allies should increase contacts with the satellites, seeking closer commercial, cultural, and scientific ties. Our object, Ford told Pearson, is to wean them away to some degree from extreme dependence on the Soviet Union and to encourage any developments which will ameliorate the lot of the satellite peoples. Even as the Canadian cabinet considered these recommendations, their future was cast in doubt by reports of growing unrest in Hungary. Policymakers in Ottawa were surprised when protesting students and workers in Budapest clashed with Soviet troops. Dependent on newspapers and second-hand reports from Washington and London for its information, the government, Greg Pearson and Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent, were happy to leave Western policymaking to its great power allies, the U.S., France, and Britain. On October 26, 1956, Pearson simply associated Canada with an Anglo-American request to have the Security Council at the UN discuss the Hungarian crisis and the question of foreign military intervention. Like its NATO allies, Canada hoped the restrained Security Council resolution, framed to attract the support of non-aligned India and Yugoslavia, would isolate but not aggravate or irritate the Soviet Union. More important, Ottawa hoped the UN proceedings might halt the bloodshed in Hungary and allow Premier Nagy room to negotiate an end to the crisis, quote, on terms better than mere repression of anti-Soviet rioters. Initially, at least, there appeared to be some evidence that this cautious strategy would meet both the government's domestic and foreign policy requirements. Reassuringly, Canadian opinion makers, the press, and the East European immigrant community in Canada showed little interest in the first days of the crisis. From the foreign policy perspective, the cautious Western strategy also seemed to be working. Pearson was encouraged by the pause in fighting that followed the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Budapest on October 29th, and Moscow's declaration the next day that it was ready to re-examine its relations with Eastern Europe. But with Hungary still in the balance, the UN was suddenly gripped by a second crisis, and a preemptive Western initiative on Hungary, whatever that might have been, was now impossible. As the world's focus on Hungary wavered, Soviet forces tightened the noose around Budapest. The subsequent attack on the 4th stunned Pearson, who was physically exhausted by his efforts to broker a ceasefire in Egypt and the Suez crisis. In his memoirs, Pearson recalls being, quote, tempted to have the UN Assembly Committee fly straight to Budapest with the UN flag and some men in UN uniforms. Of course, that didn't happen. Ever the realist, the foreign minister dismissed the idea as an emotional reaction. Short of war, all the West could do, Jules Leger, our future Governor General, and the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, told the Prime Minister was to, quote, bring it in upon the Russians that they stand alone and isolated before world opinion. Like other Western leaders, Pearson and Saint Laurent savaged the Soviet Union in public statements and rallied behind a series of UN resolutions condemning the communist state. Canadian efforts to punish and isolate Moscow were limited, however, by several considerations, and we pulled our punches. Canadian diplomats continued to hope throughout the crisis that Moscow could be persuaded to treat the Hungarians generously. They advised the Prime Minister to go easy, and that we, quote, must not go so far that we nullify whatever chances may remain of moderating to some extent the severity of Soviet repression. Canadians were worried too about the danger of driving the Soviet Union back into Stalinist isolation and the possibility that the UN General Assembly might pursue such extreme action as the expulsion of Hungary. As early as December 1956, Canada sought a reduced role in the UN debates on Hungary. The Suez Crisis, too, introduced other factors that constrained and limited Canadian diplomacy. This was especially true of Canada's approach to the non-aligned movement and its leader, India. Since the late 1940s, Canada had made a sustained effort to court that Asian nation. As Scott Reed, Canada's High Commissioner in New Delhi, long championed this policy, and he urged Ottawa to mount a major initiative in November 1956 to win Nehru's support and quickly and truly isolate Moscow. But Reed found this crusade quickly hampered by Pearson's struggle in New York to create a peacekeeping force in the Middle East, an initiative that depended on Indian and non-aligned goodwill. Though Pearson accepted the diplomatic trade-off philosophically, India's refusal to rally to the Hungarian cause left many Canadian officials feeling bitter and betrayed and put an intolerable strain on that relationship. I think we must agree, concluded Ford, that the action of the UN on Hungary was largely a failure. The one lesson that might profitably have been learned by the Arab-Asian group concerning the nature of the Soviet system had been obstinately refused. Although Canadian diplomats pulled their punches in the global effort to isolate Moscow, they were among the first in Ottawa to recognize the fleeing refugees as a problem that Canada, with its empty spaces and booming post-war resource economy, could address effectively. Even before the final assault on Budapest, the Austrian government had issued an urgent appeal for help, prompting one Canadian diplomat, Marcel Cantu, head of the department's consular division, to observe that if we were to move fast, we might relieve a serious situation and admit some useful people. This was not yet the view held by the Department of Citizenship and Immigration, or its affable minister, Jack Pickersgill. A long-time and powerful aide to Prime Ministers Louis Saint Laurent and Mackenzie King, Pickersgill joined the cabinet as immigration minister only in 1953. Though cabinet approved these measures, Pickersgill refrained from immediately unveiling the amended policy. Instead, he summoned church and ethnic groups as well as provincial and municipal representatives to a one-day conference in Ottawa on November the 27th to gauge domestic support for a large-scale refugee movement. Reassured by the reaction and spooked by news that the Conservative government in Ontario was itself ready to bring over Hungarian refugees, the minister returned to cabinet to demand a more generous offer. As Canada was the only country making the refugees pay for their transportation, he now proposed to take the unprecedented step of having his department cover these costs. Cabinet reluctantly agreed and sent Pickersgill himself to Europe to signal the government's new resolve. The more forthright and generous policy announced on November the 28th and Pickersgill's subsequent high-profile trip to the refugee camps in Austria sharply increased Canada's intake of refugees. By mid-December, according to one contemporary account, refugees were arriving in Toronto at the rate of 100 a day. By month's end, over 4,000 Hungarians were scattered in homes and reception centres across Canada. By the time the program formally ended in September 1958, the total had climbed over 37,000 refugees. Even before the refugee flow had ceased, the implications of the Hungarian crisis for Canadian diplomacy and immigration policy were evident. Ironically, the crisis reinforced the trend towards moderation in Canada's approach to Khrushchev's Soviet Union and its East European satellites. While some, like the ardent anti-communist Marcel Cadieux, favored a hardline policy, most, despite the tragic events in Hungary, continued to support Ford's policy of constructive engagement. In this interpretation, and I'm quoting from the departmental memorandum, the revolution in Eastern Europe and Soviet military intervention demonstrated the failure of Russian policy and were proof that Canada's policy of encouraging the trend towards liberalism was the correct one. The department's moderation offset the more strident anti-Soviet inclinations of the conservative Prime Minister, John Diefenbaker, who took office in June 1957. And the department's moderation ensured that Canadian policy, despite the occasional detour, remained temperate on most East-West questions during the next decade. The tragic events of November 1956 had a more ambiguous impact on Canada's relations with Hungary. There was much more substance to the bilateral relationship after November 1956. The revolution had rendered Hungary important for Canadian political international affairs observers, and the refugee crisis had produced a dramatic increase in bilateral consular disputes as families divided by the crisis later tried to reunite. Nevertheless, Hungary, alone of all the East European states, remained largely excluded from the benefits of Canada's liberal policy of constructive engagement. Indeed, Budapest's efforts to pursue normal relations were so firmly rebuffed by Canada throughout the late 1950s and into the mid-1960s that one Hungarian diplomat wondered why Ottawa, quote, thought it necessary to be more purist than the major Western allies. The crisis also had a lasting impact on Canadian immigration and refugee policy, notwithstanding Pickersfield's initial hesitant efforts at policymaking. Though his caution reflected the government's modest view of Canada's place in the world, it undermines any Canadian claim to a particularly heroic role during the crisis. But the decision to admit almost 40,000 refugees, however reluctantly it was reached, was not inconsequential, and Canadian immigration historians largely agreed on its significance. The exodus made it clear that East European migrants were unlikely to be Soviet agents, finally ending once and for all the post-war ban on immigration from communist countries. Equally important, perhaps even more important, the vital role of domestic pressure in convincing Ottawa to open its borders established a precedent for those Canadians who wanted to persuade the government to adopt a more generous attitude towards other migrants. Drawing on the Hungarian model, Canadian refugee advocates joined with community groups in responding to the refugee crisis in Uganda in 1970, in Chile in 1973-74, and Southeast Asia in 1979-80, forcing Ottawa each time to liberalize its refugee policy and changing the very face of contemporary Canada. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dr. Donahue, for this informative presentation. Our next pièce de résistance is a performance by the well-known 12-member vocal ensemble Musica Intima of Vancouver. They will sing two works by 20th century Hungarian composer Zoltán Kodály in the original Hungarian, coached by Eva Kossuth and very generously sponsored by Dr. Mary Terei Smith. The English translations of the titles are set out in your program.
Amen.
for this moving and spirited performance in flawless Hungarian. These are Mr. Kalman Opre's graphite drawings, a step-by-step story of the events of the freedom fight based on the audio-visual presentation Remember 1956, written and compiled by Mr. Opre. Unfortunately, however, it cannot be shown here for reasons of copyright. Here, on both sides of the wall, posters tell the story of the 10 heady days when it seemed that the revolution had succeeded. But it was not to be. On November 4th, Soviet tanks rolled in and brutally crushed the uprising.